The jungle planet of Salvora 9 was a place where hope went to die. The air was thick with mist, the cries of unseen predators echoing through the twisted trees and jagged rocks. Every sound felt like a threat. Every shadow hid danger. And somewhere in the middle of this living nightmare, a small figure crouched behind a broken piece of ancient stone, shivering, alone, and terrified. Princess Zyra wrapped her arms around her knees, her violet skin streaked with dirt and tears. Her silver hair fell in tangled strands around her face, and her eyes darted around, wide and fearful. She had been left here, cast away by the very people who were supposed to love and protect her. The Dravani Empire had called her weak, a disgrace, a burden unworthy of the throne. And so they had abandoned her on this hostile, forgotten planet where the strong survived and the weak perished. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath her. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunched over leaves and broken branches. Zyra froze, her small dagger clutched in her shaking hands. Through the mist, a hulking shape emerged, a Threxian hound, one of the deadliest predators on Salvora 9. Its 6 glowing eyes locked onto her, and its jagged teeth gleamed as it snarled, low and hungry. Zyra tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The beast lunged, and then there was a sharp whistle. The creature's head jerked up. A second later, a single gunshot cracked through the air, and the Threxian hound collapsed with a heavy thud. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then a figure stepped out from the shadows. Tall, broad-shouldered, and human. His rifle still smoked from the shot, and his green eyes scanned the jungle with a calm, practiced focus. He looked battle-worn, his face lined with scars and his clothes torn and dirtied, but there was something about him that felt steady, safe. "You're a long way from home, kid," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. Before Zyra could answer, the ground shook again, this time from explosions. Bright flashes lit up the distant trees, and the sound of ships descending from the sky roared above them. Ethan Cross glanced up, his face hardening. "We need to move. Now." She didn't argue. She didn't even hesitate. When he reached out his hand, she took it, and they ran. 2. Ethan led her through the jungle with the ease of someone who had been running from danger his entire life. They pushed through the thick foliage, leaped over fallen logs, and ducked under low-hanging branches as the sound of their pursuers grew closer. Zyra stumbled more than once, but each time, Ethan was there, steadying her and pushing her forward. After what felt like hours, they found shelter in the wreckage of an old freighter half buried in the ground. Inside, the air was cool and still, and the thick metal walls muffled the sounds of the jungle outside. Ethan sat her down on a crate and began patching up a deep gash on his arm. "Why? Why did you save me?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look at her. Because no one deserves to be left behind. For the first time in days, Zyra felt a spark of hope. This human, this stranger, hadn't abandoned her. And maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't. Over the next few days, Ethan taught her how to survive. He showed her how to move quietly, how to find safe places to sleep, and how to fire a blaster without closing her eyes. He was patient but firm, and though the training was hard, she found herself growing stronger. One night, as they sat around a small fire hidden deep in the jungle, she finally found the courage to speak about her past. "My people said I was weak, that I'd never be a warrior, never be a queen." "They're wrong," Ethan said without hesitation. "You just haven't had the chance to fight back yet." But their brief peace didn't last. The next day, the enemy found them. Drones swept through the jungle, and soldiers followed close behind. Their hideout was compromised. They ran again, and this time, the enemy was right on their heels. 3. General Sci-Fi stood on the bridge of his warship, watching the planet below with cold, reptilian eyes. He was a towering figure of muscle and steel, his armor glinting in the dim light. He had been given a simple mission: Eliminate the princess and anyone foolish enough to stand in his way. Find them, he growled. Bring me the human's head. On the ground, Ethan and Zira stumbled into the ruins of an ancient outpost. It was there that Ethan found their one chance. A working cloaking device. It wasn't much, but it might just keep them hidden long enough to escape. But the enemy was already closing in. Zira's breath caught in her throat as she saw the soldiers moving through the trees, heavily armed and merciless. Ethan pushed the device into her hands. Stay close, he whispered. The battle was swift and brutal. Ethan moved like a shadow, his rifle picking off enemies with deadly precision. But there were too many of them. When one soldier cornered Zira, she raised the blaster Ethan had given her and fired. The alien fell. Zira stared at the weapon in shock, her hands trembling. You did good, Ethan said, his voice filled with pride. You're stronger than you know. 4. They couldn't keep running. Ethan knew it was time to fight. Over the next few days, their training intensified. He taught Zira how to set traps, how to use the cloaking device to her advantage, and how to fight hand-to-hand. One night, as they rested, Ethan finally told her the truth. I was a soldier once. My squad was abandoned, just like you. I survived because someone believed in me. Now I believe in you. But their bond was tested when the enemy found them again. In the chaos of their escape, Ethan was injured, saving Zira's life. Blood soaked his clothes, and his face was pale with pain. You can't leave me, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I'm not going anywhere, he promised, his voice weak but determined. 5. The ruins became their battlefield. Using human strategy and alien tech, they turned the ancient outpost into a deadly trap. When Sci-Fi himself descended onto the planet, Ethan faced him in brutal combat. The warlord was stronger, faster, but Ethan was smarter. As they fought, Zira faced her own battle. Drevani soldiers cornered her, their weapons raised. And that's when something inside her snapped. Energy crackled around her, and with a single cry, she unleashed a wave of power that brought the ruins crashing down on their enemies. But the victory came at a cost. Ethan lay motionless on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. Zira fell to her knees beside him. Please, don't leave me, she begged. 6. But Ethan's eyes fluttered open. Told you, not going anywhere. With Sci-Fi defeated and the Drevani forces in retreat, Zira finally claimed her strength, not as a princess, but as a warrior. As they stood at the edge of the jungle, Ethan looked down at her. So, what's next, Your Highness? Zira smiled. I think we make them regret ever abandoning us. And together, they walked into the rising sun, ready to take on the galaxy. Ethan Cross moved through the jungle like a ghost, his steps silent and sure, his sharp green eyes scanning every shadow. The thick, humid air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and distant danger. Behind him, Zira struggled to keep up, her small body trembling with exhaustion and fear. But she never once complained. She kept moving because Ethan kept moving. And right now, he was the only thing standing between her and death. The distant rumble of explosions echoed through the trees, and Zira flinched at the sound. Ethan glanced back, his face hard but calm. They're getting closer, he muttered. We need to move faster. Zira nodded, biting her lip to keep from crying out as she stumbled over a gnarled root. Her legs ached, her lungs burned, but she pushed on. She had to. The human had saved her life. And now she owed him her survival. They'd reached the edge of a steep ravine, the ground falling away into darkness below. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed a thick vine, tested its strength, and swung across with practiced ease. Zira stared at him in wide-eyed amazement. Come on, kid, he called softly. You can do this. She didn't believe she could, but she trusted him. So she grabbed the vine, took a deep breath, and jumped. The air rushed past her in a blur of fear and adrenaline, And then strong hands caught her, pulling her safely to solid ground. "See," Ethan said with a rare hint of a smile. "Told you you could do it." But their bond was tested when the enemy attacked again. In the chaos of their escape, Ethan was injured, saving her life. Blood soaked his clothes, his face pale with pain. "You can't leave me," Zara whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, his voice weak but determined. The ruins became their battlefield. Using human strategy and alien tech, they turned the ancient outpost into a deadly trap. When the enemy commander, General Sci-Fi, descended onto the planet, Ethan faced him in brutal combat. Sci-Fi was stronger, faster, but Ethan was smarter and more determined. As they fought, Zara faced her own battle. Dravani soldiers cornered her, their weapons raised, and that's when something inside her snapped. Energy crackled around her, and with a single cry, she unleashed a wave of power that brought the ruins crashing down on their enemies. But victory came at a cost. Ethan lay motionless on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. "Please, don't leave me," Zara begged, her voice breaking. But Ethan's eyes fluttered open. "Told you, not going anywhere." With Sci-Fi defeated and the Dravani forces in retreat, Zara finally claimed her strength, not as a princess, but as a warrior. As they stood at the edge of the jungle, Ethan looked down at her. "So, what's next, Your Highness?" Zara smiled, her eyes filled with determination. "I think we make them regret ever abandoning us." And together, they walked into the rising sun, ready to take on the galaxy. The air had grown colder, the jungle's dense humidity giving way to a strange stillness. The kind of quiet that only meant one thing: danger. Ethan Cross felt it in his bones. He moved with caution, his sharp eyes scanning the darkened trees, his weapon ready. Beside him, Zara followed his every step, her small face tense with fear she was trying so hard to hide. They had been on the move for days now, always just a step ahead of the Dravani soldiers hunting them. But this felt different. The air was wrong. The jungle itself seemed to be holding its breath. Ethan stopped suddenly, holding up a hand. Zara froze, her wide violet eyes locked on him. "What is it?" she whispered. Ethan didn't answer right away. He listened. The distant hum of drones was gone. The sounds of wildlife had vanished. All that remained was the rustle of leaves in a breeze that didn't feel natural. He turned slowly, his instincts screaming at him. And that's when he saw it. A flash of movement, high up in the trees. Too fast, too silent. "Run," Ethan said softly. Zara didn't question him. She bolted, her small feet barely making a sound on the forest floor. Ethan followed, keeping her ahead of him, his rifle sweeping the trees. He knew what this was. Not soldiers, not drones. This was something far worse. The Dravani had sent a hunter. He heard it then, the soft hiss of a cloaking device deactivating. A shape dropped from the trees behind them, landing with the grace of a predator. Ethan turned and fired without hesitation. The first shot hit nothing but air. The second sparked against armor, and then the hunter was gone again, melting into the jungle. "Faster," Ethan urged Zara. She stumbled, her breath ragged, but she didn't stop. Ahead, the jungle thinned out into rocky cliffs. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being trapped among the trees. They reached the edge of a narrow path winding along the cliffside, just as a blast of energy scorched the ground where they had been standing moments before. Ethan spun, firing again, and this time he saw it clearly. The hunter was tall and lithe, covered in sleek black armor that shimmered as it bent the light around it. Its face was hidden behind a mask, glowing red eyes tracking them with terrifying precision. It moved like a shadow, silent and deadly. They didn't have time for this fight. Ethan grabbed Zara's hand and pulled her along the rocky path. The hunter followed, moving impossibly fast. Another shot grazed Ethan's shoulder, the pain sharp and immediate, but he didn't slow down. They reached a narrow overhang just as the hunter fired again, and the blast sent rocks tumbling down into the chasm below. "We can't outrun it," Jaira gasped, fear in her voice. Ethan knew she was right. They were running out of ground, and the hunter was gaining. He made a split-second decision. "Keep going," he ordered. "Find cover. I'll deal with this." "No." Jaira's eyes filled with panic. "I won't leave you. You have to." Ethan's voice softened. "I'll find you, but you need to stay safe. Go." Tears threatened to spill, but she nodded. She turned and ran, disappearing around the bend in the rocks. Ethan turned back, his jaw tight. The hunter stepped into view, its movements slow and deliberate. It knew it had him cornered. Ethan raised his rifle. "You want me? Come and get me." The hunter charged. The fight was brutal. Ethan fired in controlled bursts, his shots precise. But the hunter was fast, dodging with unnatural ease. They closed the distance too quickly, and suddenly Ethan was on the defensive, blocking a blade that seemed to appear from nowhere. Sparks flew as it scraped against his rifle. The hunter struck with inhuman speed and strength. Ethan barely managed to stay on his feet, his breath coming hard. But he was human, and humans didn't give up. He fought with everything he had, using the narrow terrain to his advantage. He kicked out, sending the hunter stumbling back, and managed to land a shot that sent it reeling. But it wasn't enough. The hunter recovered too quickly, slashing out with its blade. Pain seared through Ethan's side, and he fell to one knee. The hunter loomed over him, raising its weapon for the final blow. And that's when Zara screamed. "Leave him alone." The hunter turned just as she fired. The small blaster Ethan had given her spat energy, the shot hitting the hunter's armor and making it stagger. It wasn't enough to kill it, but it was enough of a distraction. Ethan didn't waste the opportunity. He surged up, slamming his rifle into the hunter's mask and firing point blank. The blast sent the creature sprawling, its cloak flickering wildly. "Run," Ethan shouted. But Zara didn't run. She stood her ground, her tiny frame trembling but defiant. "Not without you." The hunter wasn't dead. It rose slowly, its mask cracked, red eyes burning with fury. Ethan knew they wouldn't survive another attack. "Zara," he said quietly, "when I tell you to." But before he could finish, the ground beneath them gave way. The cliffside crumbled, and they fell. The world became a blur of dust and stone. Ethan hit the ground hard, pain exploding through his body. He heard Zara cry out, but he couldn't see her. His vision swam. He tried to rise, and then the hunter was there, standing over him once more. But this time, Ethan wasn't alone. Zara's small hands closed around a jagged piece of metal, and with a fierce cry, she drove it into the hunter's side. The creature roared, spinning toward her, and Ethan took his chance. He fired his last shot. The hunter fell. The jungle grew silent once more. Ethan lay back, his chest heaving. Zara crawled to his side, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "You're okay," she whispered, more to herself than him. "Yeah," he managed, his voice weak. "Thanks to you." They stayed there for a long moment, the adrenaline slowly fading. Finally, Ethan forced himself to sit up, wincing. "We need to move," he said. "More will come." But as they walked, something had changed. Zara walked taller, stronger, and for the first time, she didn't look afraid. Because now she knew. She wasn't weak, and she wasn't alone. The sun dipped low over the jungle, casting long shadows through the trees. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the sounds of distant creatures and rustling leaves. Ethan Cross sat by the fire, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness beyond their small camp. His body ached from the fight with the hunter, but he pushed the pain aside. There was no time for weakness, not when more enemies could come at any moment. Across from him, Zara sat quietly, her small frame hunched and tired. She hadn't spoken much since their fall from the cliff. Ethan watched her, noticing how she clutched the piece of metal she had used to save him. It was bent and useless now, but she held it like a lifeline. "You did good back there," Ethan said, his voice gentle. Zara looked up, her violet eyes meeting his. "I was scared," she whispered. "Courage isn't about not being scared," Ethan replied. "It's about standing your ground even when you are." She didn't answer, but a small flicker of pride crossed her face. Ethan knew she needed more than words right now. She needed to be ready. The Dravani wouldn't stop hunting her. And next time, they might not be so lucky. "We need to train," he said after a long silence. Her brow furrowed. "Train. If you're going to survive, you need to learn how to fight, how to defend yourself." He tossed her one of the smaller knives he carried. She caught it awkwardly, staring at it like it might bite her. I don't know how," she said softly. "That's why we start now." Ethan stood, motioning for her to do the same. "Come on." For the next few hours, the clearing became their training ground. Ethan taught her the basics, how to hold the knife, how to keep her balance, how to strike without hesitation. At first, she was clumsy, her small hands trembling as she tried to mimic his movements. But she didn't give up. "Again," Ethan said each time she faltered. And again, she tried. The sun had long since disappeared when she finally landed her first real hit, the flat of her knife tapping against Ethan's arm. He grinned despite himself. "Not bad, princess." She smiled, and for the first time, it reached her eyes. But the moment didn't last. The jungle was still dangerous, and the night was growing colder. They sat by the fire again, sharing a small meal from their dwindling supplies. "Why are they hunting me?" Zara asked suddenly. Her voice was quiet, but there was an edge of fear beneath it. "Why do they want me dead?" Ethan hesitated. He had avoided this conversation for as long as he could, but she deserved the truth. "Your father," he began slowly, "wasn't just a king. He was the last real threat to the Dravani Empire. When they invaded your homeworld, he fought back harder than anyone expected. He nearly won." Zara's eyes widened, but he didn't. Ethan shook his head. "They wiped out your people, your family, and they think if you survive, you could inspire what's left of them to rise up again." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "I'm just a child," she whispered. "You're more than that," Ethan said gently. "You're their hope, and that's why they're afraid of you." The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows across their faces. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Zara wiped her eyes and looked up at him with a determination he hadn't seen before. "Teach me more," she said. The next morning, training began again. Ethan pushed her harder this time, teaching her how to move silently through the jungle, how to set traps, how to fire a blaster with accuracy. She learned quickly, faster than he had expected. There was a sharpness to her, a focus that belied her age. Days passed. They moved constantly, staying ahead of the Dravani scouts. Every night, they trained. Every day, they survived. And slowly, the bond between them grew. One evening, as they rested by a small stream, Zara spoke up. "You never told me why you're helping me." Ethan's jaw tightened. The memories were still fresh, even after all this time. "The Dravani took everything from me," he said quietly. "My home, my family, my people fought, and we lost. But I survived, and I swore I'd never let them do it again." She watched him carefully. "Is that why you saved me?" He met her gaze. "I saved you because it was the right thing to do, and because I believe you can end this war." Her breath caught. "Me? You're more than just a child, Zara. You're the last of your line. And one day, your people are going to need you to lead them." The weight of his words settled heavily on her shoulders. But instead of fear, there was something else in her eyes. Resolve. That night, Ethan didn't sleep easily. His mind was too full of what was to come. He knew the Dravani wouldn't stop, and sooner or later, they would find them again. He just hoped they'd be ready when they did. The night was too quiet. Ethan knew what that meant. Sitting by the dying fire, his eyes stayed fixed on the darkness beyond the trees. The jungle was never silent, unless something dangerous was near. His grip tightened on his blaster as his instincts screamed a warning. Sierra sat close, sharpening the knife he'd given her. She was more focused now, more confident. Weeks of training had changed her from a scared child into someone ready to fight. But Ethan still saw the worry in her eyes. She felt it too, the calm before the storm. "They found us," she whispered. Ethan nodded slowly. "It won't be long now." The Dravani had been hunting them relentlessly, their search growing more intense with each day. The last attack had come too close, and Ethan knew they wouldn't get lucky again. "We have to make a stand," he said, his voice low but steady. "We can't keep running." Sierra's fingers tightened around the knife's handle. "But how? There's only two of us." He looked at her, really looked at her. She was afraid, but she didn't back down. That fierce determination in her eyes told him she was ready, and that gave him hope. "We make them come to us," he said. "We choose the ground, set the traps, and when they arrive, we fight." The next hours passed in a blur. They worked fast and silent, turning the jungle into a battlefield. Ethan taught Sierra how to rig explosives from their limited supplies, how to set up tripwires and snare traps. She learned fast, faster than anyone he'd ever trained. As dawn broke, their preparations were done. Ethan climbed a rocky outcrop overlooking the clearing and watched the tree line. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of smoke and metal. They were close. "Stay behind me," he told Sierra, "no matter what happens." But she shook her head. "I won't hide. I can fight." He wanted to argue, but there was no time. The first shot cracked through the air, and the jungle exploded with movement. Dravani soldiers poured from the trees, armored, armed, and relentless. Ethan fired first, his blaster cutting down the lead scout. Sierra stayed at his side, her hand steady as she aimed and fired. The traps worked. Explosions tore through the clearing, sending dirt and fire into the air. Soldiers fell, screaming, as the jungle turned against them. But there were too many. Ethan's heart pounded as they fell back, moving from cover to cover. A Dravani warrior charged them, and Sierra met him head-on. She ducked his swing and drove her knife into his side, her face set with grim determination. Pride surged through Ethan, but there was no time for it. More soldiers came, and the fight grew desperate. Then the hunter arrived. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to twist as the massive figure stepped into the clearing. The Dravani hunter was taller than any of his soldiers, his armor black and gleaming. A long, curved blade rested in his hand, and his eyes locked onto Sierra with predatory hunger. Ethan moved without thinking. He fired, but the hunter was fast, too fast. The shot missed, and then the hunter was on him. Ethan barely blocked the first strike, the force of the blow sending him crashing to the ground. "Run," he shouted, but Sierra didn't move. The hunter raised his blade, and then Sierra attacked. She was a blur of motion, her knife flashing in the dim light. She struck fast and hard, and for a moment, it looked like she had the advantage. But the hunter was too strong. With a single backhand, he sent her flying. "No," Ethan roared. He surged to his feet, pain forgotten. He attacked with everything he had, his fists and blade moving with brutal efficiency. But the hunter was stronger, faster. The fight was hopeless. Ethan knew it, but he wouldn't stop. Not until his last breath. The hunter's blade flashed, and pain bloomed in Ethan's side. He fell to his knees, his vision swimming. The hunter raised his weapon for the killing blow, and then Sierra screamed. The air seemed to crackle with energy. The ground shook as a wave of power burst from the small princess. The hunter staggered back, his eyes wide with shock. And then Sierra was moving, her knife a blur of silver and rage. She struck with precision and fury, her blade finding the gaps in the hunter's armor. He roared in pain, but she didn't stop. With a final, desperate strike, she drove the knife into his throat. The hunter fell. Silence descended over the jungle. Ziara stood over the body, her chest heaving. Then she turned and ran to Ethan, dropping to her knees beside him. "You're hurt," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'll live," he said, though the pain was terrible. You did it." Tears filled her eyes. "I didn't want to lose you." "You won't," he promised, his hand closing over hers. "Not today." As the sun rose over the battlefield, the last of the Dravani flood, they had won. But the war was far from over, and Ethan knew one thing for sure: Zara was ready. "You said." The battlefield was silent now, the smoke from the fires drifting lazily into the early morning sky. The scent of scorched earth and blood still hung heavy in the air, but the danger had passed. Ethan lay on the cold ground, his body racked with pain, but his eyes never left Zara. She knelt beside him, her small hands pressed against his wound, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You have to be okay." Ethan tried to smile, but the pain made it hard. "I've been through worse," he said, though his voice was weak. You did good, Zara. You saved us." Her eyes filled with fresh tears. "I was so scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I couldn't let them take you. You're all I have." He wanted to tell her she was stronger than she realized, braver than anyone he'd ever known. But the world tilted around him, and darkness began creeping at the edges of his vision. "Ziara, you need to get help." "No," she said fiercely, her grip on his hand tightening. "I'm not leaving you." But he knew she had to. If she didn't, he wouldn't make it. "Please, Ziara, go." She hesitated, torn between fear and determination. Then finally, she nodded. "I'll come back. I promise." He watched her disappear into the trees, her small figure vanishing into the shadows. And then the darkness took him. When Ethan woke, the world was warm and soft. The pain was still there, but it was distant, dulled. He opened his eyes slowly, and the first thing he saw was Vera's face. She was sitting beside him, her head resting on her arms, her eyes closed in exhausted sleep. He tried to move, and a sharp pain flared in his side. The sound made Zara jerk awake. Her eyes went wide when she saw him. "Ethan." "Hey, kid," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Told you I'd live." Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time they were tears of relief. I thought I was too late." He reached out, his hand brushing against her hair. "You weren't. You did good." She smiled then, a real smile, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the weight of fear lifted. The days that followed were filled with quiet recovery. Ethan slowly regained his strength, and Zara rarely left his side. She brought him food and water, tended to his wounds, and told him stories of her people, of the life she had lost. But there was something different now. The fear that had once defined her was gone. She stood taller, spoke with more confidence. The little princess who had once been forsaken had become a warrior. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ethan sat by the fire, cleaning his blaster. Ziara sat across from him, her eyes thoughtful. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Ethan looked at her, seeing not a frightened child, but a strong, determined young woman. "That's up to you," he said. "The Dravani won't stop. They'll come back, and when they do, we'll be ready." She nodded slowly. "I want to fight. I want to protect the people who can't protect themselves." He smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "You'll make one hell of a fighter, Ziara." But there was more to it than just fighting. He knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. They needed allies, a plan, and most of all, they needed hope. One night, as the stars stretched across the sky, Ethan told Ziara about Earth, about the resilience of humanity, the way they fought against impossible odds and never gave up. She listened with wide eyes, captivated by the stories of courage and defiance. "Do you think Earth would help us?" she asked hesitantly. "I think they'd fight like hell for you," Ethan said. "If there's one thing humans understand, it's protecting their own." For the first time in a long while, hope flickered in her eyes. The decision was made. They would leave the jungle behind, find a way off this planet, and seek help from the one place that had never backed down from a fight. The journey wouldn't be easy. The Dravani would hunt them, and the danger would only grow. But Ethan knew one thing for sure: they wouldn't face it alone. Together, they would build a new beginning.